One of the things that really jumped out at me reading this book were the sort of Dr. Strangelovian aspects of these experiments and the grotesque indifference that the scientists seem to have to the most basic rules of safety. You described, for instance, how in September 1950, scientists from one of these secret laboratories secretly blanketed the whole city of San Francisco with spores and sulfur particles. What were they doing and why?
The idea was, how do you attack a coastal city in an enemy country without it seeming as if you're attacking that city? And the idea was to get a bunch of sort of high volume nozzles and spray out a disease that would sort of fog the entire coast. And they needed to find out how that would work. And so they had a ship go back and forth along the coast, along San Francisco and Richmond and the whole Bay Area, actually, and just sort of fog the entire coast with a simulant that behaved like one of the substances in the actual weaponized arsenal, but that was not, in fact, thought to be toxic, or wasn't very toxic. It did happen to kill some people because there were people who had secondary infections related to this this simulant. The simulant was useful to them because it was red, and so you could see on a petri dish, if you had a sampling station somewhere, let's say in Berkeley, California, you had a sampling station, a little box somewhere. You could take that petri dish and look at it and see that some of the colony had grown of this thing. And what they found is that, yes, that they could fog an entire urban area with a disease, and nobody would know, except that they would say, boy, the weather is bad. And in fact, there's news reports in that period where people in San Francisco said, God, the city smells horrible today. So there was something going on. There was something odd with the weather, but there was no knowledge that it was actually a secret CIA-run, Navy-run program to find out whether this could work or not. It was just one of many, many efforts. It's so interesting to me that the first victims of a project to create a novel weapon are usually the scientists involved in making the weapon, or the people in the country who are actually, on the side of the scientists making the weapon. There was a lot of unplanned sickness that happened in the United States as a result of our weapons program aimed at Russia and China.
I mean, so I was just thinking about them when you're talking about, diseases spreading and getting out of control. Mm-hmm. That resonates a lot more with people today than it might have done 10 or 15 years ago, because we're all so conversant with, preventing diseases and the effects that they may have. Do you think that changed the reception of the book?
I don't. At the time that the book came out, I think that people, quite rightly, were focused on what was going on right now. And so what was going on in 1951 was much less interesting to them. I think over time, certainly it altered my experience of the pandemic, because I had just been reading about lab leaks, one after another, American accidents in laboratories where they were trying to increase the transmissibility or the virulence of a certain obscure disease that would be difficult to detect or difficult to diagnose. And they would then somebody would fall sick. They would be trying to mass produce anthrax, for instance, and the guy was developing a new method for making large quantities of anthrax, and he inhaled the spores, and then he died. And his death certificate said that he had died of, I don't know, of pneumonia or something like that. So there are all sorts of lab accidents that are part of the history of the American Cold War. So when I heard about a strange disease that had suddenly appeared in a place that was very close to a laboratory that was looking into risks of that disease, I couldn't help it. I mean, obviously, I thought that it was a strong possibility that it was a lab accident from from at least May of 2020, when it came out that the National Institute of Health, America's premier science funding agency, was paying the Chinese laboratory to do these experiments. I thought, well, there we go. It's a gigantic effort to show that certain things are disease threats, and to come up with vaccines against them, not to make weapons, but to make vaccines. And something went wrong somewhere. It's at least possible. So I had that reaction. It's only now, a year into it, that more people are saying this. I don't want to say that I was the first person to say this, because there were many smart, well-informed people who were saying there's something wrong with the story of bats spontaneously evolving this disease that was hyper adapted to make human beings sick.
The researchers often develop a sort of strange relationship with these people in the past. I wanted to ask you whether that was the case with you, because you often write with a strange, almost affection about these men who are doing bizarre, almost evil things, but you get to know them in a quite intimate sort of way. I wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the characters that you uncovered and the relationship you had with them.
Well, I didn't feel a great deal of affection for them, but I do feel it's important to understand that people are human beings, and that they have complicated characters. One of the classic examples is Jimmy Doolittle. He's a war hero. He led the initial firebombing raid on Japan, Doolittle's Raiders, and he was considered the most famous Air Force hero of World War II. He was also a tremendous fan of biological weapons and of covert action. So he gave talks, and I had no idea about this, but just going through the papers that had been declassified in the Clinton administration, I'm going through and seeing a transcript of a talk that Jimmy Doolittle, this war hero, is giving on how important it is to have these biological weapons, and how we've had some setbacks about them and things haven't gone quite right, but we feel that if we, with renewed application, we'll get some of these germs, in fighting shape. And I just think, and it was he's such an interesting person. He liked to box. He's just a complicated, they're all complicated people, and morally repellent. But, just saying that somebody is morally repellent doesn't get you very far if you're writing a book. You have to actually try to understand what is going through the mind of somebody. Why does Jimmy Doolittle say the United States must use reprehensible, underhanded methods of dealing with this foe, the communist foe, because the communist foe is so evil and so crafty, so resourceful, that there's nothing that unless we are willing to succumb to this communist threat, that we're going to have to fight them using every underhanded technique we can possibly come up with, including germs. So what leads him to say that? It's this strange fear. It's this idea that communism is itself an infection. It is a disease. It is catching, and it is caught. Giant swatches of the earth have been infected with this disease, and therefore we have to come up with other diseases that will counter-infect humanity with this, the disease of democracy.
As you said earlier, you're writing about events that took place a long time ago in the 1950s or shortly thereafter. Some people might say, okay, this is all very interesting, but how and why does this ancient history matter? So if you were able to find the smoking gun, if you were able to get the document that you wanted out of the Freedom of Information Act, what do you think would happen and what would you want to happen?
Well, I think in some ways, one of the documents that I wanted to come out, I did come out towards the end, mysteriously, as I was just putting the last bits and pieces of copy editing in the book. I got in the mail from the National Archives a completely unredacted version of a certain document. It was a 1949 plan, a deception plan that was intended to trick the Soviet Union into thinking that the Americans had come up with a super germ weapon, perhaps a missile delivered germ bomb or something. And they were going to put out in the paper that they had come up with this thing in hints and little suggestions. And then it would cause the Soviet Union to waste its scientific efforts in order to duplicate this weapon, which was probably an anthrax weapon. So what did the Russians do? They, in fact, threw a lot of scientists on the developing of this weapon, and they developed the weapon. So we had an actual arms race created by this deception plan. So the whole effort, the whole struggle that has been going on between America and Russia with these weapons is part of this strange creation of the strategy that you will somehow wear out the other side by tricking their scientists into thinking something can be done, and then their scientists figure out that it can be done. And the Russian weapons labs, biological weapons labs, were unbelievably resourceful and creative and frightening. So we had this sort of an armed biological weapons arms race that carried way into the 70s as a result of this document. So that, for instance, was something that happened to me because I had written this book and I was in the final phases of it. Mysteriously, this it had been all blacked out before that, almost unreadably blacked out, and then it came in the mail with no blackout. So somebody had said, let's give this guy Baker at least one document that is clean. And I was so happy about that. I mean, it feels like it makes the point, that you've got to be able to read these things, because with the blackouts, it's just a mosaic of nonsense. But with the redactions removed, it's really quite clear what was going on. The Americans wanted to trick the Soviet Union into believing a certain thing was true that wasn't true. I think there's so many things are like that the story is actually fairly straightforward and simple if you could just get behind some of the black rectangles that are waiting there. And whether we will ever get behind some of them, I don't know. There are some documents that have been destroyed, so all you have now is the blacked out versions. I asked for I wanted the redactions removed of this expert in sugarcane crop diseases. Who was he? And more of the paragraph about him to be revealed. And the guy wrote back, the guy from the CIA wrote back, those original documents are gone. All we have is the redacted version. We will never know what is behind those blackouts, because the blackouts are all we have.